The year was 1884, and the land around Lone Mesa was so quiet you could hear your own blood pumping in your ears. It was a hard land, baked by a sun that didn't forgive, and on that land, carved out of the same red rock, was Luke Nez's ranch. Luke was a ghost. At 33, his face was a road map of grief, his eyes hollowed out by a fever that had stolen his wife and son 2 winters back. He was a man made of silence. The house stood strong, the corral was upright, but the man inside was just an empty shell. Until the day the dust moved. He saw it from a mile off, a slow plume rising from the wagon road. Not many folks came this way. Not many dared. A small cart, pulled by a horse that was mostly bone, creaked to a stop at his gate. A woman sat on the seat, straight-backed. Her face was pale from the road, but her hands on the reins were steady. She stopped right by the sign he'd burned into a plank weeks ago. Help wanted, cooking, care for stock. He'd put it up because the silence in the house had started to scream. He never thought anyone would answer. The woman stepped down. Her boots hit the dirt with a firmness that spoke of a long, hard journey. She walked right up to the porch where he stood leaning, his hat pulled low, his eyes watching her like a hawk. "You're the owner?" she asked. Her voice was tired but level. He just nodded. "Luke Nez." "I'm Ruby Hale," she said. "I saw the sign." His eyes flicked to the sign, then back to her. A ghost of a woman answering a ghost of an ad. "Plenty ride past that sign," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I didn't ride past," she answered. The wind groaned through the porch slats. The air was thick with things unsaid. "You know stock? Cooking?" he finally asked. She lifted her chin. "I do. And I work hard." He looked at her then, really looked. He saw the dust and the exhaustion. But he saw something else, too. A deep, familiar sorrow pressed into the lines around her eyes. It was the same sorrow that stared back at him from his own reflection. "Don't need trouble here," he said flatly. "I've had enough trouble of my own," she replied, her voice quiet, but strong as iron. "All I need is honest work." He looked past her, at the small cart. A single trunk and a mandolin case, tied down tight. A whole life packed into 2 boxes. He thought of his own empty rooms, his cold stove. He thought of the crushing weight of being alone. After a long moment, he gave a short jerk of his head. "Kitchen's round back. Side room's empty. Pump's by the well." She gave the smallest nod. "That will suit me fine." No handshake, no smile, just 2 broken people standing on either side of a door that hadn't been opened in years. She went to get her trunk. He watched as she lifted it herself, her movements strong and sure. She didn't wait for his help. She didn't ask for it. As she passed him on the porch, her skirt brushed against his leg. It was nothing, a flicker, but Luke felt it like a spark in dry timber. Inside, the house was a tomb of dust and shadows. Ruby set her trunk down in the small side room, then walked straight to the kitchen. The stove was cold stone. "Do you have coffee?" she asked. Luke blinked, startled by the simple question. "Beans. In the jar." Without another word, she untied her bonnet, shook the dust from her dark hair, and got to work. The scrape of the grinder, the splash of water, the hiss of a match. Soon, the crackle of a fire filled the dead air. And then a smell he hadn't known in 2 years. Coffee. He stood in the doorway, just watching this stranger move through his kitchen as if she belonged there. She didn't chatter. She didn't ask questions. She worked with the quiet purpose of someone who knew silence as well as he did. When it was ready, she poured 2 cups. She set one on the table for him. He looked at the cup, then at her. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw past the sorrow. He saw a flicker of something else. Recognition. The kind that passes between 2 people who have lost everything and are still, somehow, standing. The wind rattled the windows, and for the first time in a long, long time, Luke felt the suffocating silence of his home begin to crack. Something had come to Lone Mesa, and he had a feeling it wasn't just honest work. The next morning, Luke woke to a sound he didn't recognize. It was the soft clatter of a pot on the stove. He pulled on his boots and stepped out of his room, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. The house was supposed to be quiet. It was always quiet. But when he walked into the kitchen, the smell hit him like a physical blow. Coffee, bacon, hot bread. Ruby Hale stood at the stove, her back to him. Smoke was curling from the chimney, a signal of life he hadn't seen before sunup in years. "You're back early," she said without turning around. His eyes scanned the room. The table was set. A plate of biscuits sat on a clean cloth. He looked at her, then at the food. Suspicion warred with a strange, forgotten feeling. "You didn't have to," he grunted. She finally turned, a wooden spoon in her hand. "I did. A house doesn't breathe without a fire in the stove." He hesitated, then sank into a chair. She poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. He took a sip. It was strong, hot, and real. It tasted like a memory he thought he'd buried. For 2 years, food had been fuel. Jerky and hardtack eaten while standing. Coffee boiled down to bitter sludge. Now, she placed a plate in front of him. Eggs, ham, warm biscuits. He picked up his fork like it was a foreign object. She sat opposite him, eating quietly. Not watching him, not exactly. But he could feel her waiting. He ate every last bite. When he was done, he pushed the plate back. A slow breath left his chest. It felt like he'd been holding it for 2 years. Ruby gave a faint, satisfied smile. "More in the pot if you want." He shook his head. "It's enough." The silence that fell between them was different. It wasn't the heavy, crushing silence of grief. It was the quiet space between 2 people at a table. It was almost peaceful. But Luke was a man who had learned not to trust peace. The days found a strange new rhythm. Ruby worked from sunup to sundown. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended a leaning fence post without being asked. She moved with a silent efficiency that was both impressive and unsettling. Luke watched her. He watched her from the corral. He watched her from the porch. He watched as she carried water, her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed. He was trying to figure her out. This woman wasn't just looking for work. She moved like someone with a purpose. One evening, he came back from the range, tired and covered in dust. He stepped inside and stopped dead. Music. A soft, sad tune plucked on a mandolin. It was coming from her room. He hadn't heard music in this house since his wife, since before. The sound was so gentle, so out of place in his harsh world, that it felt like a ghost's touch. He stood in the hall, hidden in the shadows, just listening. The next morning, he left a small carved bird on the kitchen table. Something he'd whittled years ago. He said nothing. That evening, he saw it sitting on the windowsill, catching the last of the sun. She said nothing. It became their language. He'd leave a handful of yucca seeds. She'd leave an extra biscuit wrapped in cloth by his saddle. Words they couldn't speak, passed through small, quiet objects. The house was starting to feel less like a tomb. But every time a sliver of comfort settled in his chest, he'd see something that didn't fit. He saw the way her eyes would scan the horizon, not like someone admiring the view, but like someone watching, waiting. He saw the way she always slept with her door barred from the inside. And one afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, he saw her sleeve ride up. Just for a second. On the pale skin of her forearm was a mark. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand. A strange, intricate symbol he'd never seen before. She saw him looking. She pulled the sleeve down fast, her face a mask. She turned away, her back rigid. That night, the silence was heavy again. Luke sat on the porch, staring out at the dark mesa. The ghost of a woman was in his house, a woman with secrets branded into her skin. He'd told her he didn't want trouble, but he was beginning to think trouble was exactly what she'd brought to his door. A week later, Luke made a decision. He had to know what she was hiding. He had to know what was in that mandolin case. He waited until she rode out to check the snares he'd set along the dry wash. It was the only time she left the immediate ranch yard. He watched her disappear over the ridge, a small, determined figure against the vast emptiness. Then he went to her room. The air inside was clean, smelling faintly of soap and dried herbs. It was a stark contrast to the dust and neglect that had filled it before. Her few belongings were neat: a worn dress folded on the chair, a brush and comb on the small dresser. And under the bed, the mandolin case. He pulled it out. It was heavier than it should have been. He tried the latches. They were locked, not with a simple clasp, but with a small, sturdy padlock. Who puts a padlock on a mandolin case? He felt a knot tighten in his gut. This was wrong. All of it. He took the case to the barn. In his tool chest was a set of iron files and pry bars. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he worked on the lock. It was tough. It took him nearly 20 minutes of tense, grating work before it finally sprang open with a sharp click. He lifted the lid. There was no mandolin. Instead, nestled in the worn velvet lining, was a long-barreled Colt revolver, a box of cartridges, and a thick, leather-bound journal. His blood ran cold. He picked up the journal. The leather was old and scuffed. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, elegant. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Page after page of names, dates, and locations. Next to each name was a sum of money and a single chilling word: collected. He flipped through the pages, his heart hammering against his ribs. These weren't business dealings. This was a list of men, and it read like a kill list. He got to the last written page. There was only one name: Silas Kane, Lone Mesa Territory. Payment. Justice. Luke stared at the name. He didn't know any Silas Kane, but he knew Lone Mesa. That was here. That was his land. Who was this woman? A bounty hunter? An assassin? He heard the sound of a horse returning. He slammed the journal shut, shoved everything back in the case, and slid it back under her bed just as her shadow fell across the doorway. She stood there, her bonnet in her hand. "Did you need something from my room, Luke?" Her voice was calm. Too calm. He straightened up slowly, his mind racing. He had to play this carefully. "Thought I heard a mouse." Her eyes, dark and unreadable, held his. She knew he was lying. He knew she knew. The air crackled. The quiet peace of the last few weeks shattered into a million pieces. "There are no mice in this house," she said softly. "I made sure of it." The threat was unspoken, but crystal clear. He wasn't living with a simple cook. He was living with a hunter, and her hunting grounds were his home. That night, supper was a silent war. Every scrape of a fork, every sip of water, was amplified in the tense quiet. Luke watched Ruby over the rim of his coffee cup. He saw the way her hand rested near her skirt, where a knife was likely hidden. He saw the constant, subtle scan of her eyes toward the windows, the door. She wasn't just a hunter. She was hunted. He had to get her out, before whatever she was running from found its way to his doorstep. After the meal, he stood by the hearth, his back to her. "You need to leave." The words hung in the air like smoke. He heard her set her cup down, a soft click against the wood. "Why?" "I don't want your trouble," he said, turning to face her. "Whatever business you have with this Silas Kane, it has nothing to do with me." Her face went pale. The mask of the quiet housekeeper fell away, replaced by a flash of pure steel. "You went through my things." It wasn't a question. "I found a kill list in a mandolin case. I had a right to know who I was letting into my home." She stood up, her small frame seeming to grow taller, more dangerous. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Then tell me, he shot back, his voice rising. Tell me why you're here. Tell me why you have a brand on your arm and a gun under your bed. The sign said, "Help wanted," not "hiding place for a hired gun." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, he thought she would deny it all. He thought she might even draw a weapon on him. Instead, something in her broke. The hard lines of her face softened, and the deep sorrow he'd first seen in her eyes returned, flooding her expression. "Ruby Hale is dead," she whispered, her voice cracking. Luke froze. "She was my sister," the woman continued, tears welling in her eyes. "She died 6 months ago on the trail to Santa Fe, robbed and left for dead." She took a shaky breath. "My name is Sarah, and Ruby wasn't just robbed, she was murdered by a man named Silas Kane." The revelation hit Luke like a physical blow. This wasn't about money, this was about vengeance. "The journal," he said, his own voice now quiet. "The names. Men from his gang," she explained. "I've been tracking them for months, one by one. The trail for Kane, the man who gave the order, it went cold, until I found a letter in the last one's camp. It mentioned a deal going down near Lone Mesa." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "Your sign. It was a sign for me, too. A way to get close. A place to watch, to wait. I never meant to bring this to you, Luke. I thought I could handle it alone." He sank back into his chair, the whole world shifting under his feet. The strange behaviors, the watchfulness, the brand on her arm. It all clicked into place. "The brand?" he asked softly. She looked down, instinctively covering her arm. "Kane's mark. He gives it to everyone in his crew. He gave it to my sister before he was done with her. A mark of ownership." Her voice was filled with a venomous hatred. Luke looked at this woman, Sarah, and saw not a killer, but a grieving sister pushed to the absolute edge. He saw a pain that mirrored his own, the helplessness, the rage, the crushing weight of loss. He had wanted to drive a shadow away with a rifle and knife. She was doing it with a Colt and a ledger. The silence that filled the room now was not one of tension, but of shared, terrible understanding. "This land is all I have left," he said, more to himself than to her. "I know," she whispered, "and I'll leave. I'll go in the morning. I won't let him take this from you, too." He should have agreed. He should have let her walk out of his life and take her war with her. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he looked at her, standing alone in his kitchen, a warrior disguised as a widow, he felt something he hadn't felt since the fever. A purpose. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You're not leaving." She looked up, shocked. "If this Silas Kane is coming to Lone Mesa," Luke said, standing to face her, "then he's coming for us both." In that moment, the silent pact between them was sealed. It was no longer his ranch and her fight. It was their fort and their war. The next few days were a blur of tense preparation. The unspoken truce had become an alliance. Luke and Sarah moved with a shared grim purpose. He taught her the land, the hidden gullies, the high watch points on the mesa, the places where a man could disappear. She taught him about his enemy. Silas Kane was more than a common outlaw. He was cunning, cruel, and patient. He moved like a snake, striking when his prey was weakest. "He'll come when he thinks we're not expecting it," she said one afternoon as they scouted the ridge. "After a storm, maybe, or in the dead of night." Every sunset felt like a countdown. Every howl of a coyote made them jump. The small, quiet moments of their earlier days were gone, replaced by a constant humming vigilance. But in its place, something else grew. A strange, fierce trust. He saw the way she handled the revolver. Not with anger, but with a cold, steady resolve. She was good. Frighteningly good. She saw the way he moved through the desert. Silent. Knowing. He was a part of this land, and she realized Cain wasn't just coming up against a lone rancher, he was coming up against the mesa itself. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thunder cracked like a whip. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Luke nodded, his hand resting on the rifle he now kept propped by the door. "Bar the windows. I'll check the stock." The rain came down in sheets, turning the yard to a river of mud. Luke fought his way to the corral, the wind tearing at him. He secured the gate just as a bolt of lightning lit up the entire sky. In that flash of white light, he saw it. A single boot print, deep in the mud, right by the water trough. It wasn't his, and it was fresh. His heart leaped into his throat. He wasn't coming. He was already here. Luke spun around, peering through the driving rain. He saw nothing but swirling darkness. He sprinted back to the house, bursting through the door, soaked and breathless. "He's here," he choked out. "Someone's been at the well." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her revolver from its new hiding place above the stove. "Where?" "I don't know. He's gone now, but he was close." They spent the rest of the night in the dark kitchen, weapons ready, listening to the storm rage outside. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sounded like a footstep. But the attack never came. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose on a clean, washed world. There was no sign of anyone. The boot print was gone, washed away by the rain. It was as if it had never been there. A tense week passed. The memory of the boot print lingered like a ghost. They took turns sleeping. They ate their meals in shifts, one always watching. The strain was beginning to show. Dark circles formed under their eyes. Then, one morning, Luke felt it. A strange weakness in his limbs as he threw hay for the horses. A dizziness that made the world tilt. He ignored it. He told himself it was exhaustion. But by midday, he was shivering despite the desert heat. He stumbled back to the house, every muscle aching. Sarah took one look at his pale face and ashen lips, and her own face went white with fear. "Luke," she said, rushing to his side as he collapsed into a chair. She pressed a hand to his forehead. It was burning up. "Just tired," he mumbled, his teeth chattering. "No," she said, her voice tight with a terrifying certainty. "This isn't a normal fever. This is poison." The boot print at the well. It wasn't a failed attack. It was the attack. Silas Cain had poisoned their water, and Luke had been drinking it for a week. Panic seized Sarah, cold, absolute terror. She stared at Luke, shivering and delirious in the chair, and all she could see was her husband. The same clammy skin, the same labored breathing, the same creeping shadow of death in his eyes. She had failed to save her husband from a sickness. How could she fight a poison she couldn't even see? The memory of her failure, the whispers of her being cursed, rushed back, threatening to drown her. She wanted to run. But then Luke groaned, his eyes fluttering open for a second, finding hers in the haze of fever. And in that moment, he wasn't her past. He was her present. He was her ally. He was the only person on earth who knew her real name. The fear didn't vanish, but a cold, hard rage pushed through it. "Not again!" she snarled to the empty room. "You don't get to take him, too!" Action snapped her out of her paralysis. She half carried, half dragged Luke to his bed. She stripped off his sweat-soaked shirt and began bathing him with cool water. But she knew that wouldn't be enough. This was a war inside his body, and she needed an arsenal. She ran out of the house, not toward the tainted well, but toward the dry washes and rocky crevices of the mesa. This was Luke's land. He had taught her its secrets. Now she would use those secrets to save him. Her mind, which had buried the knowledge for years, began to work. She remembered the lessons her grandmother, a healer, had taught her. She saw the plants not as weeds, but as medicine. Sage for the fever, willow bark for the pain, yarrow to fight the poison's grip. Her hands, so steady with a gun, trembled as she gathered the herbs. What if she was wrong? What if she chose the wrong plant? What if she was just a cursed woman playing at being a healer? She pushed the doubts down. She had to try. Back in the kitchen, she worked frantically. She crushed, she boiled, she strained. The air filled with the sharp, bitter scent of desert medicine. She created a dark, potent tea. She carried it to the bedroom. Luke was barely conscious, muttering deliriously. "Luke," she said, lifting his head, "you have to drink this. Fight it." She pressed the cup to his lips. He coughed and choked, but she was relentless, pouring the bitter liquid down his throat, drop by drop. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not sleep. She kept the fever cloths cool. She forced more of the herbal tea into him every few hours. She sat by his bed, her revolver on her lap, watching the door, her ears straining for any sound. She was fighting a war on 2 fronts: the poison inside him and the man who put it there, waiting outside. On the 3rd night, the fever peaked. Luke's body convulsed. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. Sarah held his hand, her own body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She thought she was losing him. She bent her head and prayed, not to a God she no longer believed in, but to the stubborn, resilient spirit of the man in the bed. "Don't you leave me here alone," she whispered, her tears falling on his hand. "Don't you dare." And then, as dawn approached, something shifted. The violent shivering stopped. A deep sweat broke across his skin, drenching the sheets. His breathing, though still shallow, evened out. The fever had broken. Sarah sagged in her chair, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her black out. She rested her head on the edge of the mattress, her hand still clutching his, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours later, she awoke to a sound. It was her name. "Sarah." The voice was a hoarse whisper, but it was clear. She lifted her head. Luke was awake. His eyes were open, and they were focused. He was looking at her. "You're awake," she breathed, relief washing over her again. He swallowed, his throat raw. You saved me." She shook her head. I remembered things." He squeezed her hand weakly. "He did this." "Yes," she said, her voice hardening. "Cain. He knows I'm here. He was trying to take you out of the picture." Luke looked at her, at the exhaustion etched on her face, the fierce loyalty in her eyes. He saw the woman who had faced down her own ghosts to save him. "This is my fight now, too," he rasped. "He came for my home. He came for my water. He came for me." He paused, his gaze intense. "He came for you." In the quiet of the sick room, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer just allies. They were partners. But as Luke slowly regained his strength over the next few days, a new, chilling realization dawned on them. Cain hadn't just poisoned the well to kill Luke. He was flushing them out. They couldn't stay there, with no safe water. They would have to make a run for it, for the nearest town. And out in the open, they would be easy targets. It was a trap. "He's got us pinned down," Luke said one evening, sitting up in bed for the first time. "We can't stay, and we can't leave," Sarah finished, pacing the small room. Luke's gaze drifted to the window, toward the high, silent cliffs of the mesa. His grandfather's words came back to him, stories from his childhood he hadn't thought of in years. Stories of the old ways, stories of hidden water. "There is another way," Luke said slowly, a spark of an idea forming. "My grandfather used to talk about a place, a hidden spring, deep inside the mesa. He called it the heart of the mountain." Sarah stopped pacing. "Is it real?" "I don't know," Luke admitted. "I always thought it was just a story. But if it is real, it would be our only chance." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a forgotten legend. But it was better than waiting to die. The next morning, Luke was still weak, but determined. He drew a rough map in the dirt floor of the kitchen from what he could remember of his grandfather's tales. It pointed them toward a series of narrow, winding canyons on the far side of the mesa. "It should be somewhere in there," he said, pointing with a stick. "Behind a rock that looks like a sleeping bear." They packed what little they could carry, a canteen filled with the last of the boiled, hopefully safe water, dried meat, their weapons. Leaving the ranch felt like abandoning a part of themselves. They barricaded the door and windows, making it look as though they were still holed up inside. It might buy them a few precious hours. Then, under the cover of a moonless night, they slipped out the back, melting into the shadows of the desert. The journey was brutal. Luke, still recovering, had to stop and rest every 100 yards. Sarah, her senses on high alert, watched their backs, her revolver always in her hand. The silence of the desert was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, filled with unseen threats. After hours of walking, they found the canyon. It was a dark, narrow slit in the rock, barely wide enough for them to pass through single file. They pushed deeper, the rock walls rising high above them, blotting out the stars. The air grew cool and damp. And then they saw it. Up ahead, a massive boulder, shaped uncannily, like the head and shoulders of a sleeping bear. It was real. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He pushed against the rock. It didn't budge. He and Sarah pushed together, their shoulders straining. With a deep, grinding groan, the massive stone scraped aside, revealing a dark opening. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of wet earth and stone. They lit a lantern. The narrow opening led to a small cave, and in the center of the cave, bubbling up from the rock itself, was a pool of crystal-clear water. The heart of the mountain. They drank, the water so cold and pure it was like drinking life itself. As the water revived them, they looked around the cave. It was a hidden sanctuary. And then Sarah saw something glinting in the lantern light, half buried in the dirt near the spring. She knelt and dug it out. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. Her hands trembled as she wiped the dirt away and fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a smiling young woman. "Ruby," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. It was her sister's locket. The terrible truth crashed down on them. This wasn't just a random outlaw camp. Cain had been here. This hidden spring was his base. This was where he had brought her sister. And that's when Luke saw the scratches on the cave wall, hidden behind the pool. They weren't natural marks. They were letters, crudely carved into the stone. He held the lantern closer. It was a single word. Silver. Silver, Luke read aloud. What does that mean? Sarah was staring at the locket, then at the word, a horrifying idea dawning on her. Cain wasn't just an outlaw. My sister wrote that he was obsessed with finding an old Spanish silver mine, a lost treasure. They looked at each other, the full weight of the discovery settling upon them. This was never about robbery. It was never just about a random murder. This land, Luke's land, held a secret far more valuable than water. Silas Cain hadn't just killed for a few dollars. He'd killed for a fortune. And he had no idea they were now sitting right in the middle of it. But their moment of revelation was cut short by a sound from outside the cave, the unmistakable scrape of boots on rock, and a low, cruel voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I know you're in there. The whole ranch is empty. There's nowhere else you could have gone." It was Silas Cain. He'd found them. They were trapped. The voice was closer now, just outside the entrance. "I gotta hand it to you, Apache. I never figured you knew about the old spring. Or did the little lady lead you here? She's got a knack for finding my places." Luke and Sarah flattened themselves against the far wall of the cave, extinguishing the lantern. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin sliver of moonlight at the entrance. "This ends tonight, Sarah," Kane's voice echoed in the small space. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long. I'll get that journal, and then I'll finish what I started." Sarah's breathing was shallow. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her revolver. All the months of hunting, all the rage, had led to this. A tomb of rock. Luke put a hand on her arm, a silent signal. He pointed toward the pool of water, then back at himself. He had an idea, a desperate, insane idea. He whispered in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "When he comes in, you shoot for the rock above his head. Don't try to hit him, just make noise. I'll do the rest." She looked at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. She didn't understand, but she saw the fierce resolve in his face. She trusted him. She nodded. They heard the grinding sound of the boulder being pushed aside. A silhouette appeared, blocking the moonlight. Kane was stepping inside. "Now!" Luke hissed. Sarah raised her revolver and fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The bullet sparked off the rock ceiling right above Kane's head. Kane cursed and stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the flash. That was the only opening Luke needed. He exploded into motion. He didn't run at Kane. He ran to the spring. He grabbed a loose, heavy rock from the edge of the pool and, with a guttural roar, heaved it into the water. The splash was enormous. But it wasn't the splash that was the weapon. It was the water itself. The displaced water surged over the lip of the spring, a miniature flash flood. It poured across the cave floor, turning the dirt to slick, thick mud. Kane, his eyes still adjusting, took a step forward, and his feet went right out from under him. He hit the muddy ground hard, his gun flying from his grasp. Luke was on him in an instant. It wasn't a fight of bullets or knives. It was a primal, brutal struggle in the mud and darkness. Luke's rage, for his family, for his land, for the woman fighting beside him, gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. Sarah scrambled for Kane's discarded gun. She found it, its metal cool against her fingers. She got to her feet just as Kane managed to throw Luke off. He staggered up, a long knife appearing in his hand. He lunged at Luke. "Luke, look out!" Sarah screamed. Luke rolled aside, the knife slicing through the air where his throat had been. Kane turned, his face a mask of fury, and came for him again. But he never made it. Sarah fired. This time, she wasn't aiming for the ceiling. The shot hit Kane square in the leg. He howled in pain and collapsed back into the mud, clutching his shattered knee. It was over. Silence fell, broken only by Kane's pained gasps and their own ragged breathing. Luke got to his feet, covered in mud, his body bruised, but his eyes blazing. He walked over to where Kane lay writhing. "This is for my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And my son." Sarah stood over him, her own gun now steady, pointing at his head. "And this," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "is for Ruby." They didn't kill him. That would have been too easy. They took his knife and his guns. They used his own rope to bind his hands and feet. And they left him there, in the dark, in the mud, beside the treasure he would never claim. They rolled the stone back into place, sealing the cave. His muffled screams were soon cut off by the heavy rock. Justice, in the desert, was often silent, and it was always final. They walked out of the canyon and into the first light of dawn. They didn't look back. They walked side by side, not as a rancher and his housekeeper, not as allies of convenience, but as two people who had walked through the valley of death together and come out the other side. The silence of Lone Mesa was still there, but it was no longer a silence of grief or fear. It was a silence of peace. When they returned to the ranch, it felt different. It was no longer a tomb or a fort. It was a home, their home. The authorities in Santa Cruz were notified of an outlaw, Silas Kane, who had met his end in the unforgiving wilderness. The official story was simple. He got lost, he ran out of water, The desert claimed him. No one questioned it. The ledger Sarah had kept was burned in the kitchen stove, its dark purpose finally fulfilled. The silver mine remained a secret, buried in the heart of the mountain, its treasure less valuable than the peace they had found. With the threat gone, life settled into a new, deeper rhythm. One evening, as the sun set, painting the mesa in shades of orange and purple, Luke came into the kitchen. Sarah was kneading dough, flour dusting her arms. He came up behind her and placed something on the table. It was a necklace, carved from bone, shaped like a desert flower. "It was my mother's design," he said quietly. "It means a bond chosen, not by blood, but by heart." Sarah turned, her hands still covered in flour. She looked at the necklace, then up at him, her eyes shining. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. "I don't want to call you my helper, Sarah. I want to call you my wife." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "Luke Nez," she whispered, "I think you already have." They were married under the wide open sky, with the old vaquero from the next valley over as their witness. Sarah wore her best dress, and the bone necklace rested against her throat as if it were made for her. Spring came again to Lone Mesa. This time, it brought new life. Sarah's garden flourished, and soon her belly began to swell. Luke built a cradle from cedar wood, his hands, once used to breaking horses and fighting for his life, now moving with gentle, careful precision. One morning, they stood on the porch, watching the wild gray Mustang that had haunted the ridges. For the first time, the horse didn't run. It walked slowly toward the corral, dipped its head, and drank from their trough. It had finally come home. Luke slipped his arm around Sarah's waist, his hand resting on their unborn child. "Looks like even the wildest things can find a place to belong," he said softly. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, a peaceful smile on her face. So did we. That summer, the cry of a newborn baby finally broke the long silence of Lone Mesa, filling the house not with ghosts of the past, but with the promise of a future. It was a home built by two souls who had faced the darkest parts of the world and of themselves, and found the courage not just to survive, but to live. If you believe Luke and Sarah earned their peace, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories where the deepest wounds lead to the greatest strengths. Thanks for watching.